Today we are diving into the world of automated code modernization with Jonathan Schneider, CEO and co-founder of Moderne. Jonathan leads Modern, a company that is tackling one of the biggest challenges facing enterprise development teams today, modernizing massive code bases at a scale. Through their open source rewrite project and commercial modern platform, they are helping organizations transform legacy code in minutes rather than months, which is a critical capabilities as companies race to keep pace with the evolving technologies and security requirement. In today's conversation, we will explore how Jonathan's team built OpenRewrite as an open source foundation, how Modern differentiates itself in the crowded developer tool market, and where AI-powered code agent fit into the future of software development. We'll also hear a lot about their recent Code Remix Summit and how enterprises are measuring real value for automated code modernization. So, without further ado, let's dive in with Jonathan from Moderne. Jonathan, it's great to have you back on the show.
Great. It's great to be back, Swapnil.
It's my pleasure. And as we were discussing before we hit the record button, that last we saw each other was 4 years ago. It's been a long gap. Even I forgot about the company. I'm pretty sure that our viewers know. But just for my benefit and the benefit of our viewers, please tell us a bit about the company, the problem you're solving, and in these 4 years, how the company has evolved before we talk about the actual topic, which is going to be open rewrite and other stuff that you folks are working on. But let's start with the foundation, the basics, the company.
Moderne is really all about large scale source code refactoring. So application modernization, escaping from vendor lock and moving one from one vendor to another, security vulnerability repair, anything that needs to change in the source code across many repositories. That's what we're really focused on.
And in the last 4 years, how has the market evolved, which led to the evolution of the company, or the mission, the company has been the same ever since you folks created it?
Really, in many ways, this is a problem that's familiar to me dating back to Netflix 10 years ago when I founded our open source technology, OpenRewrite. But I had gone on to Pivotal on the Spring team, worked with many of Pivotal's large enterprise customers, and saw this pain point as one that was really acute, and ultimately decided to start a different company. When we did decide to start the company in the middle of 2020, I think there was a lot of disbelief that large scale code refactoring or changes was a tractable problem. I mean, there just wasn't much in the market on that. And that was actually our greatest headwind for the first solid year or 2 years. If there's been any change lately, it's that the sort of arrival of AI has lifted this veil of disbelief, not just on our solution space, but I think a lot of them.
When you folks working on OpenRewrite, the open source project, what was the idea? What was the goal? What is the problem that you're trying to solve with that?
The very first problem I tried to tackle back at Netflix was actually just finally removing an old logging library we had written. We just wanted to move to an open source one, but there were millions of references to this thing still remaining. And you just, as much as you try to tell developers, hey, could you replace this logging library with another one? No highly paid Netflix engineer is going to come in and do that all day. Just doing that laboriously across every repository. So we were really seeking automation that would do that for us. But then the larger things that have similar resource drains on developers' times are like Java 8 to 17 migration, or you're trying to move from one database to another, or you're trying to move from one IAM provider to another. And so you have to go and clone each and every repository in your business unit and kind of work on each one and commit them. This work sometimes was so laborious that large enterprises would hire what they called software factories. They would set up whole like consultant shops internally to just do this laborious work, one repository at a time. And the unit economics of that, to be honest, are becoming increasingly broken. So that's really what we've been after.
As you mentioned, OpenRewrite, it's an open source project, and open source can solve day one problem, but for day two challenges, that's where you need the commercial support. Talk a bit about the relationship between OpenRewrite and Modern as a company.
There's a couple key points of differentiation. One is scale. So when you run an OpenRewrite recipe, you run it on one repository at a time. And the time it takes to run a recipe is proportional to the time it takes to clean compile that repository. So if you try to do that same activity across, say, 200,000 repositories, it could be very resource intensive ultimately to do that. So we pre-serialize the data that these recipes operate on, which is what we call the lossless semantic tree, everything about the code that the compiler knows and all its dependencies. We serialize that to disk, and then those same recipes can run at scale against essentially pre-computed lossless semantic trees. That really makes it computationally tractable for large organizations. We also have different tiers of licenses on the recipes themselves. So the core framework to write recipes is Apache licensed. We have some recipes that are Moderne source available. In other words, we allow end users to use them, but we do not permit them to be packaged into third-party solutions for resale. I'll come back to that in a moment. And lastly, we do offer a growing catalog of proprietary recipes for high value use cases around security or modernization or migration that we also offer to customers. The MSAL or source available license middle there that I just described was really the catalyst for that was the arrival of tools like Amazon Q-code transformer, which while it says it's AI, is really primarily based on our open rewrite rules-based technology. We've seen similar products like Broadcom Application Advisor, also built on top of open rewrite and trying to be sold independently. So what we're really looking to do with that source available license is bring those larger hyperscalers into a partnership relationship with us rather than a competitive relationship.
And as you're also talking about the license, of course, it's a very very controversial,
It
kind of.
is.
When I talk to a lot of folks, the basic is that, yes, either you go with open source or you go with proprietary, or you start with something. But
Mhm.
the problem is that, when we start open source companies, we are passionate about solving that problem. We don't,
Absolutely.
none of us are like start with the business opportunity. We're like, hey, somebody is having this problem, let's solve, or scratching your own itch. But then as the project mature, then you feel like, hey, a lot of folks need it, and then you're like, oh, this license is not going to work, or whatever it is. So people change it. What is your approach towards open source and open source licenses?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm very pro open source. A large portion of the last 10 years of my work is Apache licensed right now. And I've worked in open source for many years. I think we're committed to the core refactoring engine remaining there. And there's a massive amount of work that's gone into making that available. Um, it used to be, I think, that open source companies or companies that had an open source component benefited from open source in top of funnel. In other words, people would learn about you. It was great for folks to learn about your company, what you're doing, your technology, and it was always in some ways in competition with you towards the bottom of the funnel. Like, are going to lose a certain number of commercial opportunities to your own open source offering, and that's okay. And that's just part of the business of working with open source, and it's part of what you accept. It's actually becoming increasingly difficult because I think pure open source projects or the value that they deliver can be executed as tools by AI agents that never reveal that that's the tool that's being used under the covers. And so you sort of lose that recognition that your work is valuable, and the value attribution actually goes to the model or to the agent and not to you. And this is something very real we've seen recently. And I mentioned one, Amazon Q-code transformer. Andy Jassy got up on stage and said that Amazon Q-code transformer saves 7,000 years of effort. Uh, Actually, it was Open Rewrite under the covers that did that work, not Amazon Q-code transformer. And so the fact that it was open source at that time allowed them to essentially hide that.
Now, before we were recording the interview, we quickly talk about what is going to focus in more about open source or AI. You said AI, so talk a bit about what is the AI angle here.
So back to that data that we talked about OpenRewrite operating on. If you're going to do large scale code change, or really any code change at all, there's a few different representations of code. One that we're very familiar with, which is the text. That's what every developer is looking at in their editor every day. The next level below the text is what's called the abstract syntax tree. So if you're familiar with tree sitter or semgrep or something like this is all abstract syntax tree based manipulation. It's looking at the code not as just text, but as the structure of the syntax inside of it. The next level down is what the compiler does, which is to take that abstract syntax tree and go back through and solve for all the types and classes that are in use and packages that are in use, so that when you see a method call, you don't just know that it's a method called X, you know where it came from. For a lot of transformation, that knowledge winds up being essential to accurate transformation. So I know this is a bit of a wandering answer, but the thing that makes AI code authorship experiences so magical, in part, first of all, it's the language understanding on the front end. That is absolutely magical. And a key, obviously a key capability of large language models. But those large language models are being enabled by the data, the rich data that the IDE has about the code. And the IDE has a similar representation of code. It's a type attributed AST or lossless semantic tree. The combination of those two things is what makes a lot of this work possible. So, how do we grow from authorship experiences, like writing net new code that looks really magical, to doing large scale application modernization or large scale security vulnerability repair? It's that same amazing large language model text understanding, but needs a similar representation of code in the lossless semantic tree for everything that's not open in the IDE right now. And as I mentioned before, that one of the commercial differentiations between open source, OpenRewrite, and Moderne is that we allow the LST to be serialized to disk for whole business units. So then essentially you get that same feeling. I'm able to ask a question about a whole business unit's worth of code as if it was all open in the IDE simultaneously.
This is a very kind of hot and kind of heated discussion, and depending on which side of the aisle you are on, vibe coding, of course, depend on how you look at it.
Yeah.
Uh, I have my own reservations. I don't want to, be the guy
Yeah.
who says that I agree or disagree. But I always feel that AI, we use AI here as well. It's like a
Same.
tool. I'm also a woodworker, so I have a lot of power tools. They are tools. They are not
Yes.
operators. I am the operator. When we look at modern, and when we look at a lot of, AI powered code agents, how do you look at them? And does modern kind of complements them, competes with them, assist them? And what is your opinion on this topic as well? So it's like twofold question, but I would
Yeah.
appreciate
Yeah.
your answer there.
It is purely complementary in my view because it's what code agents right now are doing is helping you write net new code in the IDE. It's editing existing files. It's whatever you have open in the IDE right now. That's what it's working on. And what Moderne is doing is adding value on code modification and impact analysis for all the code that you don't have open in the IDE right now. And there is a question of why has so much money been poured into code authorship versus code maintenance or modernization when arguably the more economic value probably lies on the modernization side. And I think it's just because there was a readily available source of data about code, a rich source of data about code to these companies building that new authorship experiences. And that's the representation of code that the IDE already had. So I think really in Moderne's case, it's about building that same data source that the IDE has, but for everything that's not open in the IDE right now. And therefore, our use cases and our applications are always going to be somewhat different. In terms of, whether, and how what my relationship is to AI code agents, I'm with you. I think the woodworking analogy is perfect. Um, I have much of the intelligence and the control. I'm armed with tools and power tools all around me, and it makes me more efficient and better at what I do. But those tools don't craft a piece of furniture on their own. Yeah, in my view, I don't see it as autonomous or very close to autonomous at this point. I agree, it's a controversial point.
We assume that every organizations, every stack is modernized, but the fact is that there is a lot of legacy code, there's a lot of traditional code out there. There are a lot of industries which just can't move that fast. Financials and a lot of other critical industries are there. They will take their time, but as organizations, they do modernize their code. Refactoring can become challenging, as you also mentioned in the beginning. It's resource hungry, not in terms of manpower, but also cost,
Mhm.
downtime. How do you work with organizations? Is it more like hey, you have given them a turnkey solution, they are on their own, or you get involved deeply with their teams? I just want to know the process, how you work with your customers.
This is a really interesting question. It's really even a two-part question. So the first is the applicability of this technology to legacy stacks versus modern stacks. And I think intuitively, we think we first reach for the legacy stacks. How do I get the legacy stack to be more modern in the first place? And there certainly is a ton of that work to be done. The counterintuitive thing, I think, is that the more modern the software stack, the more subject it is to change or churn with the third party and open source components upon which it relies. So, you know, I could make the optimal architectural decisions today, the latest version of this library, the most advanced this or that. I could make all the right decisions right now. 6 months, a year from now, my decisions will be suboptimal because there's a new zero-day security vulnerability. This API has been retired. So we don't get to write a piece of code optimally and then it just goes. We always kind of have to constantly restitch this. And interestingly, the more modern the stack, the more of that restitching has to be done because it just simply relies on more third-party and open source stuff by its very design. The second part of this question was about how we work with these organizations, and I think this is also a great question, especially for those that are interested in building companies. For our largest customers, especially, we value placing technical account managers or essentially consultants on a permanent basis in those accounts with code access that are expert recipe developers and working side by side with them in the trenches to develop custom recipes that perform whatever their highest impact concerns are right now. There are some recipes out of the box that they just use and are off to the races with, but many of them they take and combine off-the-shelf recipes with custom steps as well to craft it for their environment. So it's always a mixture of out-of-the-box stuff and custom stuff that delivers the value that they need.
Who would you consider your competitors in the market, and what edge do you have over them?
I wouldn't characterize this as competitor necessarily, but competition really is manual work. That's what did this work before. It was cloning one repository at a time and doing this work laboriously. So one might perceive the traditional systems integrator to be a competitor because they did do this through software factories very laboriously for many of their large customers. But I don't think that they ultimately perceive it as a competitive threat because the opportunity is to do that same work, that big, platform shift, that big application modernization, but at a lower unit cost. And if you believe, as I do, that there's basically an unending amount of this work out there in the world to be done, in fact, many of it doesn't ever get started simply because we just don't have enough. We're supply side constrained on the engineers doing the work. Then lowering the unit cost just means that our stacks get more modern and get better, uh, without causing anybody any economic disincentive.
Can you also talk about security, because you are refactoring, and every time code is written, as Linus once told me, that bugs are part of software development process. Every time you write a code, you introduce bugs, and those bugs can become security at some point. What is your approach towards ensuring that you don't introduce any bugs like that, even if it is not inevitable, but still?
First of all, I love you dragging that line back from Linus because it leads to another point, which is that the cost of a debugged line of code is higher than the cost of a net new line of code. And so I think to those out there that imagine I don't actually need to modernize anything because I'm just going to write wholesale from scratch, whole new applications using this or that agent, don't necessarily appreciate that cost of debug line of code. I think there's an old article from Joel Spolsky from almost 20 years ago now that also talks about that very effectively. The reality is that a recipe is a program. And so a recipe itself is making a change, and programs can have bugs. The good news, I suppose, is that they operate horizontally across business units. So once a bug's discovered and fixed, it can be applied at the same sort of scale, across an organization. In practical terms, when a new recipe is created, and we're like any new software, we're uncertain about its quality before it's battle tested in the wild, it tends to be applied on smaller business units and teams, and then gradually, it accrues bug feature fixes and it accrues more unit tests and becomes more and more, we become more and more confident about it over time. And that just represents really how those recipes are rolled out in customers as well.
Excellent. Once again, thank you. Now, let's also, before we wrap this up, let's talk about the recent Code Remix Summit. Talk a bit about the conference.
We had our first year of Code Remix Summit just 2 weeks ago here in Miami. I moved to Miami 3 years ago, not 3 weeks ago, 3 years ago. And it's partly important to me to bring more technology to Miami. So as a leader of a company here in South Florida, I'm going to bring more work and more visibility to South Florida if I can. But I also want to bring back or add, if I can, better developer conferences back in the US. I feel like too many of my favorite developer conferences, the ones that are really focused on doing work, kind of long hours, learning deep technology stuff, have kind of disappeared over the years in favor of sort of larger mega conferences. So our Code Remix Summit this year was 150 attendees. It's the smallest it'll ever be. We're going to double it next year. We're going to be back again in Hollywood, Florida, near Miami next year doing it. The way we organized it this year was 3 tracks. So a developer track, a leader track, and we did what was called a hack track, which is a really interesting concept that I think we're going to repeat, which is it went concurrently with the other tracks. 3 whole days. We had experts in various different technologies there at high top tables ready. And we told attendees before they came, here's what you need to pack for the hack before you come, so that when you arrive, we can do work with you. And so we saw some recipe executions, large scale modernizations happening. We saw some of our Azure friends, showing their runtime reachability stuff. We saw CodeGate folks doing things. We saw DiffBlue folks doing things. It was really interesting, and I think that was one of the things that our attendees thought was the most unique about this. So look forward to growing that next year again as well.
Jonathan, thank you so much for taking time out today. And of
Thank
course,
you.
not only talk about the company, but also explain how you are solving some of the critical problems for the folks who want to modernize their stack. Thanks for great insight. And as I said earlier, let's not have a leap year interview, and let's have more frequent discussions. But I really appreciate it. I really thank you.
Thank you so much. See you again soon.